Thank you for joining us for WTNB Today. I'm Lisa Guerin, in for Wendy Benton. Joining us today, Tim McCoy, who is a native of Bradley County, but he has so much more to talk about. How you doing, Tim?
Good, Lisa. It's great to see you again. It's
Very
good to be
good to
back
see
in
you.
Bradley County as well.
Now, how often do you get back to Bradley County? I know you and I, we're friends on Facebook. We've been friends all
Right.
of our life, but
That's right.
we get busy, so.
We do. I get back to Bradley County usually 3 or 4 times a year. I live in Baltimore now and work in Washington, D.C., but I always love coming back home.
It
And
is
it is
always
home.
good.
It's always good to come back home, and I still consider Bradley County my true home.
Yeah, and it is always fun. People always say no matter where you go, no matter what you do, when you come home, there's just that level of comfort.
That's right.
No matter how far
right.
you go or how long you've been gone, it's just something that has to do with home.
That's right. The sights, the sounds, even the smells, it tells you that you're home. So.
And hopefully the smell's a little better in Cleveland than it is in Baltimore. I don't know. I haven't been there in a long time. But it just seems like that would be sort of the big city smell or something. I don't know what the difference is.
Every
but
place has its own smell, right?
I guess so. I guess so. Well, we wanted to get you in because you've got so many interesting things going on that really tie the Bradley County community into the Civil War. That's not all you have going on, but it certainly is something that's very important, and we wanted to talk to you about that so that our listeners and our audience members know a little bit about the history of why Bradley County is so important and some of the things that happened in the Civil War that literally happened right here in this area. Now, you have been busy doing markers and, making people aware. So tell me kind of where, I guess, this project for you started. What was your initial interest in the actual Civil War and the history here?
Thanks. That's a great question, and I'll definitely want to get into it in a second. I should say to start out with, though, this has been a real collaborative effort where I've been able to provide some support. The Cleveland Bradley Chamber of Commerce have been fantastic in providing support. Melissa Woody over there, Brian Reed at Cleveland State Community College, Randy Wood and Drew Bledsoe at Lee University, the City of Cleveland, and Bradley County. So it's really been a true public-private partnership to bring these markers into Bradley County so that the stories that come from this place and that are so rich are known by more people. So why my personal interest? Well, it really dates back not too long ago, a few years ago, to finding an old photograph of one of my ancestors, my great-great-grandfather, in an old trunk of items that my grandparents left when they passed. And one of the photographs I had seen all my life. It was a wedding photograph of a soldier in a uniform and his wife in a hoop skirt. Sort of like something that always hung in my grandparents' place.
That
Knew
black
that
and
photograph.
white.
Black and
Yeah.
white, sort of yellowed
Yeah.
over the years and so forth. A fantastic photograph. But I never had asked too many questions about it until I pulled the photograph again from the trunk and I read a caption that had been written on the back that talked about my ancestor Joseph Lusk's service in the Civil War and gave some names of his officers and so forth. And I thought, well, with the internet these days, just a quick Google
Right.
and I'm going to be able to learn so much more. And in fact, I did. So
Oh,
that set me
wow.
on this path of understanding more about what he did in the Civil War. It led me to learning that I have 4 other great-great-grandfathers who served during the Civil War, all on the Union side, which is one of the really fascinating components of this history of ours, that in this part of the country, allegiances truly were split. In the case of my ancestors, all of them were on the Union side. So that's kind of what got me started. And it's been a fascinating journey and really, really interesting to learn more about what happened here in Bradley County.
I think it's interesting because when you said about finding the photo, I mean, almost immediately I was taken back to a photo. I mean, because everyone has, it's kind of a shame
Right.
really these days that we don't take regular photos hardly anymore.
Right,
We
everything's
take cell
electronic,
phone,
yeah,
yes. We save them, digitally, or we've got them on Facebook and we're posting them for everybody to see. But I can remember some of those photos even from my mom's. They would keep like shoe boxes of
That's
photos,
right, yeah.
exactly the
Yeah.
way you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I can remember some of those service members, like you're talking about as well, in their wedding photos, because of course back then it was traditional to wear the uniform.
That's right.
I don't think, and I may be wrong about this, but I don't think all servicemen actually do that in marriage today.
I don't know.
Yeah,
but
wear the
yeah.
uniform,
Right,
so to
exactly,
speak. But I
yeah.
think back then that was kind of, the way it was done. It was the tradition. But the photos when we were children didn't necessarily mean as much as they would mean to you, as you said, as you got older.
That's right.
We began, I think, a process. It's a shame, really, and I'm hoping that this will maybe spark some conversation in households with children that, they don't even know what the Civil War is.
Right. Yeah.
So a lot of times I think as children, you and I may have looked at a photo and we thought, oh, wow, that's really cool. But then as you get older and you mature, you do realize that there was meaning, and you did look to find the meaning, and then further researched and found so much more than that.
That's right.
And many people could probably do the same thing.
Absolutely, and as you say, most families have these photographs like this, and you're right. As you get older, I think you have a better appreciation and a sort of more desire to know more about who you are and where you came from, and so these photographs and other items that get passed down through the family, whether it's a favorite dish or a piece of furniture, a quilt, any of these things that get passed along, right? Those connect us to that past, and also to the broader context of the lives that our ancestors lived and the periods of time that they lived in. And of course, here we're talking about this all-important period of American history. You could argue that the Civil War is the most pivotal point in American history. So that's what we're focused on.
And that is a very important thing to remember for a lot of folks who, we talked about this a little bit earlier before we were getting ready to go on the air, about people in this area may not realize the historic significance of the war and the fighting of it in this area.
That's
so
right.
Can you give us a little more history about
Sure.
that particular time frame
Sure.
and how this area really was, because the Bradley County area was very key in the war at that time.
Absolutely. I think some of your viewers will be familiar with the historical marker that's at the museum here at 5 Points. And some of the interpretation on that sign, so the explanation, if you will, states, it gives the quote from President Lincoln. At one point, he said that holding this area here was one of the most critical objectives of the entire war effort. But to go back to the beginning, a lot of people think that the Civil War happened at Chickamauga or Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, Shiloh in West Tennessee, Franklin south of Nashville, or even farther afield, Gettysburg and Antietam. But the Civil War definitely happened in Bradley County. There was fighting in Bradley County. There were a huge presence of troops in Bradley County. And one of the markers that we've dedicated down in the Blue Springs community speaks to the huge encampment of Union soldiers that was down there, not too far from where we grew up, actually.
Yes, I was going to say.
That was down there in the early months of 1864. More than 10,000 soldiers called that valley their home for a few months, and endured a cold winter, had a 10-inch snow in March. They celebrated Easter church services down there. Some of the officers called in their wives to join them from hundreds of miles away. They sat around the campfire at night. They sang songs. They made jokes. I think it was on February 10th, 1864, the Stars and Stripes were raised here on the courthouse square for the first time in 4 years, and two of the officers from those camps down in Blue Springs came up here and gave patriotic speeches to thousands of people.
That's so amazing to even think about.
Exactly. All of this happening just right here in Bradley
know.
County. And then, those camps in the Blue Springs Valley, they were there because they were setting the stage for the big push to Atlanta. Everybody knows, of course, the story of the Atlanta campaign and the images that we have from photographs and from movies like Gone with the Wind and other accounts. That campaign started here in Bradley County. There were elements of it that started over by Chattanooga, of course, as well, but a big portion of that campaign started right here in Bradley County. And so, to your point, yes, there is a tremendous amount of Civil War history focused on Bradley County. Yes, Bradley County played a tremendous role in the war. I want to point out, just kind of in closing off that comment, that everyone thinks of the Civil War, the two sides and so forth. And as I said earlier, Bradley County is a real example of how so many communities were torn, that it wasn't all one side or the other. In the case of Bradley County, the elections that took, the votes that took place in 1861, whether Tennessee would secede or not from the Union. Bradley County overwhelmingly voted to stay in the Union. And throughout the war, the majority of the citizens here were pro-Union, and you had thousands of men who fled Bradley County and walked hundreds of miles north to the Kentucky line so that they could cross the line and join the Union Army. And some of my ancestors and many others from this county, endured those hardships in order to fight for the Stars and Stripes and the United States of America.
And the freedoms that we have.
The freedoms that we have today.
Exactly.
That's right.
And that, I think, when you think back on that and when you research it and when you see the photos and you see more of the history, even online when you're doing your research and it's almost like it takes you to a place where you do realize the hardships. We complain today if we don't have, cold water or if we don't have this and that. And they had nothing. I mean, they were walking, like you said, they walked to the Kentucky line, so they could serve and so they could be a part of what was going on. And, we just take for granted, I think, everything that was important then that happened and the dedication and commitment of those individuals.
And it happened, you're right, it happened on both sides. I mean, I just gave the example of pro-union individuals. You take someone like Myra Inman, who grew up here in downtown Cleveland, went to school next door at what was formerly the Female Masonic Institute. Her family was a family of Confederate sympathizers, and she has a wonderful diary that's been published that tells in detail the kind of hardships that she and her family endured, sometimes at the hands of Union soldiers, sometimes just as a function of the fact that the economy of the South was collapsing as the war wore on. Hardships
really
on all
both
sides,
sides.
absolutely, and severe hardships endured on both sides.
I can only imagine. I
think it's actually unimaginable for us. I mean, we have so many things that we take for granted.
You're
and
right.
to think that, a family like the Inman family or a family like the Lusk family, my ancestors, they were living with the knowledge in their minds that at any moment someone could walk through the front door and kill them.
Yeah.
Or someone could appear in their front yard and burn down their house. And their neighbor, you never knew whether your neighbors were true friends or whether they were
traitors
telling on you. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's unimaginable the kind
really
of
is.
anxiety that must have been kind of ever present in people's lives at that time.
And that it's almost, it's kind of a tragic thought when you think about what they must have gone through just trying to lay down and go to sleep at night.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whether they even could lie down and go to sleep at night. That's exactly right. There are great stories of some of these guys who were fleeing to Kentucky, as I said, who hid out along the White Oak Mountain in caves, in basically holes that were dug in the ground, and they were hidden there as they made their way north, and family members would come very secretly and provide them with food and just keep them company for a short period of time before they had to go back home and before their loved ones continued that odyssey northward.
It's so amazing. Honestly, I feel like we could talk half the day, about everything, especially the war itself, because it's huge historically, the Civil War, but just this community and some of the things that are important as we talked about. Now, you've kind of led the charge, so to speak, for some great markers that have been placed in the community. And I think I want to say historically, and you mentioned this earlier when we were talking about this area, Chattanooga has kind of touted itself a little bit as being major, area of Civil War activity.
And rightfully so.
And rightfully so,
exactly.
yes.
Yeah.
But I guess in some ways, here in Cleveland, being a resident of Cleveland all my life, just like you, well, partially. Yeah. We won't go into that. But, you don't think about this area really being touted as a great battle area, but it was. And so now you guys are kind of leading this charge to bring more attention and awareness to the Civil War and the activity here. So tell us a little bit about these trail markers that you're working on.
Sure. Well, it's true. Chattanooga, major battles took place in the vicinity of Chattanooga. Chickamauga, Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, Orchard Knob. All of these were major pivotal battles.
Yes.
And I think it's fair to say that Bradley County, the fighting that took place here doesn't measure up in terms of numbers or, the pivotal nature that some of those battles represent. But why compare ourselves let's recognize and
Let's
be
all
proud
enjoy it
of
together.
That's right. It's not either or. It's
Right,
all. And
right.
let's be proud of and recognize the history that took place right here in our home county. So what I've helped do, with help from a lot of other individuals, is to provide historical markers for a few sites where important Civil War related events took place in
Right.
Cleveland and Bradley County. We've just dedicated 3 markers. One is down in the Blue Springs community to mark the Union Army's 4th Corps encampment. Again, the tens of thousands of men who spent the winter of 1864 down there. The other is at the Fort Hill Cemetery. Why is Fort Hill Cemetery called Fort Hill Cemetery? It's because
Exactly.
there was a Union Army fort on top of that hill. In fact, 2 forts up on that ridge that protected Cleveland from Confederate encroachments after the Union Army came in and reestablished the authority of the federal government in Cleveland. And you know, one of those great stories is that I sometimes have a hard time imagining is that you had cannons on top of that hill. And so General Wheeler, the famous Confederate cavalry general, comes into Cleveland, is raiding the railroad depot, and so those cannons on top of that hill start firing. And
Toward the depot.
if you know, toward the depot,
Yeah.
and force General Wheeler and his men
It's like
to
that gave me chills.
to evacuate. Yeah, can you imagine
I
driving through there
know.
now and imagining
A
cannonballs
cannon,
flying over
yeah,
your
going
head?
across toward
So
the depot.
that's one of the markers, and of course it also refers to the fact that there are both Confederate and Union soldiers buried in the Fort Hill Cemetery. There was a train wreck south of Cleveland during the Civil War years, and I think 17 Confederate soldiers who were killed in that train wreck, a horrible accident, are buried in a mass grave at the Fort Hill Cemetery.
Oh, okay.
You have a 19-year-old guy from Ohio. This is the one that gives me chills. A 19-year-old kid from Ohio who was part of some of the first Union troops who came into Cleveland, and he was shot and killed right here on Inman Street. He didn't die immediately. There were, I think, the Hardwick family, a pro-Confederate family, the wife and one of her slaves come out into the street, pull this poor guy back into the house, and
Right.
nurse him for a couple of days until he dies. And he's buried in the Fort Hill Cemetery. Another one is Captain Dickerson. Fort Dickerson in Knoxville is actually named after this guy. He was also from up north, and he was killed in action along the Dalton Road. So if you think the Dalton
Yeah,
Pike,
Dalton
you know,
Pike.
down that way, there was a skirmish with Confederate soldiers. He was killed. He's buried there as well. And to this day, Fort Dickerson is a major landmark in Knoxville, a big park now, and has great, has great interpretation because it's a well-preserved site. So that's named after a guy who was killed right here in Cleveland and Bradley County.
So-
and then just one other marker that
Okay,
we've
tell me the
dedicated.
other.
It's the one that is next door to the studio here, actually.
Okay.
It's to mark what was then called the Female Masonic Institute. It was a school. And this is where Myra Inman went to school. The principal of the school at the time was Ainsworth Blunt Jr. Now, he's a really interesting guy because his father was a missionary to the Cherokee Indians. After the Cherokees were forcibly removed, he became the first mayor of Dalton, Georgia. So his son, Ainsworth Blunt Jr., was an educator, of course, principal of the school, and at the outbreak of the war, he was pro-Union. So he fled north, leaving the school. The school was occupied by federal troops, apparently was completely trashed. After the war was over with, the Masons filed for compensation, which they eventually received,
Right.
modest compensation for the damages that were caused to the school. But this is where Myra Inman received her education. And Ainsworth Blunt Jr., this guy who fled north, joined the 1st Tennessee Cavalry, Federal Cavalry, as one of my ancestors did too. After he left Cleveland, a few years later, he went on to get involved in major agricultural research and developed a strain of wheat called Durham, which is now the major type of wheat
Wheat.
that's used in pasta. So here's this guy,
Wow.
very sort of modest background, and goes on to do great things, and intimately tied into this Civil War history in Bradley County.
That is crazy.
It is.
I mean,
it
I-
is.
I
These are the
literally-
stories
I
these are the
know.
stories that you don't hear about. These are the stories that I think it's so important that these markers allow us to celebrate the fact that they're not being lost. That not only are they not being lost, we are now able to share them with a much broader audience and keep them alive and pass them down to future generations, reminding everybody that this is who we are.
Yeah, and this is
us.
where this happened,
This
and
is
this
where
is
it
how.
happened, and this is who we are as a community.
So just as I was thinking about you talking about the cemetery and the key people that were involved in the battle and some key names that are
Right.
buried there and
Right.
the ones in the train wreck, how do you capture that on just a marker?
It is a challenge, and I've been involved now with 4 markers. 3 of them are Civil War Trails markers. So the Civil War Trails Marker Program is a program based in Virginia. It covers a number of states in the east and southeast, and provides photographs and text, right, that tell the story.
Exactly.
Now, there are the other types of markers through the Tennessee Historical Commission. These are the ones that are kind of, you see alongside roads. They're usually silver,
Smaller,
right? Made of cast iron or something
Right.
like that, and just words,
Right.
no photographs on those. But in both cases, there's a very, very strict word limit.
Tiny, yeah.
Every fact has to be supported by, referencing and so forth and so on. You go through a real process of editing down just to the essential facts. There's so much more that we would have loved to put on these markers, but the space limitations just prevent you from doing that. But I think in the end, we do tell the critical elements of these 4 stories through these markers.
So the process of the that still intrigues me so much, because I read an article in the paper recently about the markers
Right.
and the word limits and what
That's
you kind
right.
of have to adhere. Who is the final say in those markers for this area, the Civil War Trail mark? I mean, obviously, you guys go through a process and you do kind of narrow down the photos and the text and what you want to capture
Right.
for that particular marker. But
Right.
who gives the final say?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm glad you mentioned the article that appeared in the Banner. I really want to thank the Cleveland Daily Banner for the excellent coverage that they provided to
was very good.
these markers, and really telling the story of the markers and telling some of the backstory to these markers as well. So, in the case of the Civil War Trails Markers Program, ultimately, well, first you start off with an application process, of course. We had to rush the process because the beauty of the Trails Marker Program was that they had applied for support from the federal government. So there was kind of a match, a cost match involved,
Okay.
right? So the community provides part of it, but the federal funds provide the majority of the funds
right.
for it.
Okay.
So the Trails Marker Program, that when you go through an application process, and ultimately it's the headquarters of that program that makes the final decision on the wording, in close consultation both with the state level program as well as those of us at the community level who've put them together in the first place. So a real collaboration.
Okay.
The Tennessee Historical Commission markers, it's the Tennessee Historical Commission also working in close collaboration with the sponsor of the marker that determines the final wording for the marker. Yeah.
Because to me, it's very interesting how you can try to capture, I think it's 300 characters or less, is that correct? Or right around that area?
I'm honestly forgetting. I know it's more than that on the Civil War Trails markers. The Tennessee Historical Commission markers,
Maybe.
you're not far off that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was I was trying to think, because sometimes, we get caught up in wanting to tell the entire story of what happened,
Right.
and it would be so hard for me to, try to pick and choose the small pieces that really need to. But I guess for you, I mean, you've sort of immersed yourself in the stories. You kind of do know what the key things are that really people need to know about, like the Fort Hill Cemetery, for instance. And I know a lot of people know that Fort Hill Cemetery, obviously it's named, like you said,
Right.
and people know the significance of that. But to actually know, the cannons were placed there and individuals buried there. And so how can people get more of the stories? Because I feel like today, the internet is kind of probably could be our best friend and our worst enemy at the
That's
same
right.
time.
Especially for history.
Yes,
Yeah.
but for history, right? How can people find and get more of the story about the Civil War in this area, the markers that have already been placed, and maybe future markers that you guys are going to be looking at doing?
Well, there's so many resources, and it depends on what level of detail an individual wants to go into. The fundamental, if you will, the Bible of the Civil War history,
Right.
is called the Official Records of the War of the Rebellion. It was published by the federal government in the 1890s and remains the quintessential reference point. It's a huge volumes and volumes. So
Can't even imagine.
most people probably would not want to go into that detail. But I will say that it was a huge help in understanding exactly what happened here in Bradley County,
Right.
because they're dispatches. You know, a dispatch from a Union Army officer from the Red Hill Valley, or from Blue Springs, or from here
And
in
they're
Cleveland.
just small little.
They're just little. They're
Yeah.
just little notes.
Okay.
Or there's an official dispatch about the burning of the Lusk home down on Dalton Pike in February of 1864. And there's and the same thing from the Confederate point of view. These detailed, all the correspondence they tried to amass into this huge
That
volume.
is so amazing.
But then there are other resources as well. I know that Aaron Astor up at Maryville recently wrote a book about the Civil War along the Cumberland Plateau, and really tells the story, and it kind of includes parts of East Tennessee as well. I would just encourage folks to, in doing the research, to look specifically at East Tennessee, dig into what's out there about East Tennessee. And there's quite a lot if you just dig a little bit. That
Google
really
it.
tells. Yeah, you can Google that, and that's how I've done a lot of research, frankly.
Because there
But
are a lot of books.
there are lots of
Right.
there are lots of books that have been published on this,
Okay.
and more coming out all of the time.
Yes.
Drew Bledsoe here at Lee University has written some wonderful articles and books about the Civil War.
Okay.
He's an expert. Brian Reed at Cleveland State Community College.
It's amazing.
Jim Ogden at go down to Chattanooga, and
Yeah.
of course someone
And
like
they're right
Jim
here.
Ogden. They're really local.
Right.
And we've got tremendous Civil War scholars just here in Southeast Tennessee and North
amazing.
Georgia.
That is amazing. So markers, any future markers that is this a process that continues, or is it something that as you dive more into the meat of the Civil War and your research that you find there's another marker that may need to be? How does that?
Well, again, it's a question of resources in some respect.
Okay.
Can we marshal the resources to put more markers in place? But the fact is, there are still sites in Bradley County that I believe deserve to be marked. Where
Okay.
there's a site out off the water level highway where there was a skirmish. There's an official record of which Union regiments were involved, which Confederate regiments were involved. There are things that happened around Red Clay that are not
Yes.
Cherokee history related, that are
Right.
very much Civil War related,
Okay.
that I don't believe are yet marked.
Okay.
Things around Charleston, significant skirmishes that happened around Charleston. There is a marker at the Henniger House in Charleston, but there are
Yes.
many other stories. The burning of the bridge over the Hiwassee in November of 1861 by Bradley County-based pro-Union people to try to prevent the Confederates from using the railroad to send troops up into Virginia. There are still stories that need to be marked.
So
the
maybe
campsites
future
and
markings
I hope,
or markers.
I hope so. I really hope
Okay.
so, because these are stories that really deserve not to be forgotten.
It's so easy to see that you have a passion for this, because I was going to say earlier on when we were talking, and you're spitting out, all of these dates and all of this information. And I was sitting here thinking, how does he remember that? And then I think, well, it's all about your passion. And obviously
Right.
you have a true passion for this, and a passion for also making sure that other people know and recognize the significance of the war here in this area.
Yeah. I don't really have much to add to that, Lisa. You summed it up really well. I do have a passion for this, and it's born, I think, out of a realization that we risk losing this, that we
Right.
risk completely forgetting that these thousands of people on both sides, all sides, what they experienced, and we're standing on their shoulders.
Right.
They are the ones who
Paved the
built this
way.
country, who helped build this
Yes.
country. And I believe we owe it to them to make sure that their sacrifices, their stories are not forgotten.
I think that's amazing. And I think we could sit here literally and do so many different shows about different stories that are available to talk about. But I want to thank you for coming in, because you're not in town very often. And I want to say you came to town just for me, even though you
Of
really
course I
didn't.
did.
But thank you so much, because
It's been
this
a
is
pleasure.
very important. And I hope that in the future, when there are hopefully new trail markers and new information, that you'll be able to come back and talk
I would
to
love
us about
to,
it.
I would refer the audience to the Cleveland Bradley Chamber of Commerce and its tourism initiative led by by Melissa Woody, which can provide great information on where these markers are and other things that are worth visiting in Cleveland and Bradley County.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim, so much for your time today.
Thank you, Lisa.
And you can do that by logging on to www.visitclevelandtn.com. You'll find more information there about the trail markers here in this area. And of course, as Tim and I talked about, you can always find additional information by just going online and Googling the Civil War here in the East Tennessee area. Thank you so much for joining us for WTNB Today. See you next time.